Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Kelly Brown and thank you so much for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to share with you how I edit a photo in under 3 minutes. For those of you that have watched my editing tutorials, you'll know that I like to take my time explaining every step of my process. And you'll often hear me say that it should only take me 3 to 5 minutes to edit a photo. So I thought I'd put my money where my mouth is and show you how I do it. So this is about editing one photo, not batching multiple images to create a client gallery. We're talking about one image and editing it from start to finish. Before I get started, there are 5 things that I believe are really going to help. Number 1, you need a well-exposed photo. You need to get it right in camera to make this as easy as possible. 2, turn off the internet, get rid of that Wi-Fi so that you have no distractions. 3, use a calibrated monitor, just like my ISO. And 4, using a Wacom pen and tablet are going to make you more efficient. And the last one is to create an editing workflow that will help you streamline every step from the moment you open the image right through to saving it. I have 2 completely different images that I'm going to open up in Photoshop to start with. Let's go ahead and open our first image. It's being a raw file, it's going to open in Camera Raw. This is where I will adjust the color temperature, bringing that down to around 5500 and adjusting that tint, just bringing it back. The only other thing that I will adjust for this image is just bringing back those highlights there on the side of the bowl, bottom left. So once you've made all of your adjustments in Camera Raw, we go ahead and open it. You'll notice I've got all my actions over here on the right-hand side, and I'm going to work through my workflow. First thing I will do here with this image is lighten some of the areas. As I play each action, you'll notice I will invert and then adjust the opacity of my brush and paint it only onto areas that I want to add a little bit of extra light to. Often those darker sort of red areas, but ultimately what I'm looking for is a nice kind of even spread of light and some beautiful shadows to give it some depth. All right, so I can continue to work on here. With this layer, I can save it or I can flatten it depending on where you're at, but I'm going to get through this pretty quick. So the next thing I'm going to work on are my skin reds. So playing each action as I go and adjusting the opacity of the brush depending on the areas that I want to paint that on. So concentrating on the feet, around the toes where they're a little pink, the armpit, you'll notice the legs there a little bit cooler in tone to the baby's face where there's some warmer yellow tones. Most babies that have a little bit of jaundice tend to kind of have those yellowy tones around their face and upper body. So once you're finished with that, you can then go on to correcting those blue tones, and this is where painting this on at a nice lower opacity to even out the skin tone will really help. So fixing all of these things first and only painting these layers on where you need them to be. Is what it will create a nice even tone throughout all of the skin. All right, now that we've got that skin where we want it, this is when we can go down to our beautiful skin and details. I'm going to paint on my soft baby skin at 100%. So I don't do any skin retouching as in removing blemishes or dry bits of skin or anything like that until right at the very end once I've finished all of the other steps. You can see I'm avoiding the edges there and only painting on. Once I've sort of roughly painted all of it, I'll hit that backslash key, my guide, so I can see where I've missed. I'm going to avoid, you know, sort of coming too close to the edges. So we turn that on and off and you can see the difference that's making. Bring that back down to about 60%. And that is done there. The next thing I'm going to do is add some contrast to this image. So we can do that in a variety of different ways. And come down to my quick fix actions, and this is where I like to create a neutral boost with that contrast. And I can either paint that on or I can invert that layer and apply it to the entire image, and then I can remove it from some of the areas that I don't want it to affect. But you can kind of see there just how punchy that is. And then we can warm it up a little bit, depending on how you want your images to look. Now, if I want to give it an overall sort of color tone, then that's when I'm going to come down to my season to taste actions and choose from here. And my star anise is probably one of my favorites. But what I do is I come in and I'll invert that layer called lighten, reduce the overall opacity down to here, and then paint on. No, we might even bring that back and just bring down the opacity a little bit and then remove it from those brighter areas. All right, so you've also got to define edges here, bringing that back so that we're not over sharpening the image. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is sharpen the image with my sharpen and details. So this is where I'm going to add just a little bit of sharpen and define. It's one of my preferred ones. Invert that layer mask and paint that onto the baby's face at around 100% there. And we're going to reduce that as well so it's nice and sharp. Lastly, I'm going to create a copy layer and I'm going to come in with my spot healing brush tool, get rid of some of these sort of dry bits of skin and just quickly moving around the image here. Now, obviously, a baby with a lot of skin blemishes is going to take you much longer to edit as you work through the different tones and textures of the skin to get the results that you want. However, most babies tend to have, you know, quite beautiful skin, so you can get through your editing quickly. I don't remove every piece of dry skin and I don't remove every blemish, purely because at the size that we are printing these photos, they're not going to see them. But I will remove anything that's distracting, that's caught the light in the image and draws your eye to it. But a lot of the steps throughout the editing will reduce the visibility of some of these sort of more problem areas in terms of redness. But that's about it. My advice is to never zoom in more than 100 or 200%, because when you do, you will see a lot, as you can see here, and you won't necessarily see that in a print. And when you remove all of the texture of the skin, they can look quite plastic. So keeping that texture in the skin is definitely going to produce better results not just on the screen, but in print as well. All right, so I think I am done. And I'm going to take a snapshot and you'll see my before image and then my after image. So our second image is a maternity image. I'm going to use the same steps that we used with our newborn photo. I'm going to adjust the color temperature slightly here, adjust any shadows and highlights that I need to, and open that up in Photoshop. So I'm going to crop the image first, just to remove that little bit of backdrop at the top. I still want to keep a lot of space around her and just straighten her up a little bit there. So with this little section up here, which you can see, I'm just going to use the patch tool in a copy layer. To get rid of that. And we've got a water stain. So any sort of large areas of the image that need big structural changes, or the crop, is the first thing that I'm going to do. The next thing I'm going to do is just soften the edges of my frame. So I'm going to create another copy layer, use my square marquee tool, and I'm just going to select inside the edge of the frame there and give it a nice big feather. And then we're going to go up and blur that by a lot. So just bringing back the opacity of that layer. So I'm just softening the edges there to get rid of any texture. All right, going back to my workflow actions, this is where I am going to lighten some areas of the image, so inverting that layer mask. I'm going to come down to the face here and reduce my opacity. Whenever I'm editing really dark hair like this, I always keep an eye on it, especially when I'm adding any contrast. I want shadows here, but I just want a little bit of softness in there from extra light, and a little bit of light on the belly, and so forth. Whenever I add light, it's to follow what's already there. So you can see, just adding that little bit of light. And now with that shadow on the backdrop, just lifting that a little bit. All right, I am going to use my darken layer here just to add a little bit of to the bottom of the frame here. So this was shot with natural light. So just softening what I have painted on there with a nice big brush, but making sure that that layer sort of focuses on the bottom of the image to help draw our eye to the top there. And bring it back just a little bit. All right, I am going to work on my skin reds. So painting that on. I think it's taking Photoshop longer to reduce the size of my brush than it is for me to edit. So I'm just going to remove some of those reds just from around the eyes and the nose, keeping it in the cheeks, just in the shadows here on the neck, removing it a little bit, and sometimes just on the top lip there. Having a look at the hands, around the fingertips. Not a lot, you'll notice my brush is on 19%. Okay, so this is where I don't need to create any more changes with the skin tone. It looks pretty good, and I'm going to go ahead and use my soft baby skin, which is what I use on every skin type. It should just be skin softening action. I put baby in the title of it when I didn't have to, because I use it on everything. Now I am painting this on at 100%, but because she has such beautiful skin, I'm going to bring the opacity of that right down once it's painted on. And we'll paint that just onto the back of the hands there. It'll soften the veins. And I am, so you can see before and after at 100%. So let's bring that down to about 35% just to add a little bit of softness to the texture, not too much. And we flatten that. So ultimately, there's nothing else I really need to do to this except for adding a little bit of contrast and so forth, but you can see there's a little bit of a line from her underpants, which we are going to fix, and then there's a line down here as well. So the best way to get rid of this is to just lighten those shadows, and I'm going to increase the opacity of that, invert that. And make sure the opacity of my brush is really low here. So I wouldn't try to patch that out or clone it out, because it would just make a mess, and it would be very hard to match the tone and texture of that area without losing some detail. So you can see I'm just painting on the darker areas. Let's turn that layer on and off. Now if you do have some brighter areas that you wanted to adjust, then you could use your darken layer to reduce those. You'll notice I often flatten my images. Once you get to a point where you're confident in your editing and you know that you won't need to use a lot of these layers again, you'll notice I played the lighten layer twice, but that was because I was using it at different opacities and I increased it the second time. So I'm just going over those lighter areas there. So we've got rid of that, and then just in the back of the skirt here where we've got some brighter areas, I'm going to increase the opacity of my brush here to about 20%. I'm just going to get rid of some of these brighter highlights here on the fabric that are drawing your attention towards that seam. So removing that seam could take quite a bit of time, but I think if we just reduce the brightness on some of the folds in the fabric, it won't be as visible. So you won't notice it when you're looking at the image as a whole. So just going over the bottom fabric there. And I'm going to show you, before we add some contrast, I'm going to show you one quick trick here. Alright. Coming down to my beautiful skin and details set, I have an action here called blotchy skin, which is fantastic for blotchy skin as it's called, but it's also really great at softening some of the texture in fabric. So painting that on at 100% works really well with sort of velvets like this. If parents have turned up without ironing their clothes, you can use it on those. So I'll just zoom in so you can see the difference. Down the bottom there. And you can leave that at a high opacity, or you can reduce it to where you are comfortable. And bring it down to about 70%. And that is it. Now I'm going to play one more action here from my Season to Taste action set. Black salt, and I'm going to bring the opacity of that down to about 25% and having a look about 20%. In here, using my black brush at a low opacity, I'm going to bring that layer just off the hair so that we're not losing detail. Nice. One last thing that's caught my eye before I finish and sharpen is just one little spot there in the background here where it's a little bright. So anything when I zoom out that catches my eye, I will come in and pay attention to it so that the focus remains on our subject. All right, and let's go ahead and sharpen. Once you know what you're going to do to an image and all the steps, the process becomes a lot quicker and easier for you. But let's have a look at our before and our after, and I'm really happy with that. All right, one last thing. Using my gradient tool, changing the mode to screen, bring the opacity down to around 30-35% on a white brush. What I'm going to do is just draw from this top corner here across to the other side of the screen in a copy layer, and just add that little bit of glow there. And I'm going to do it one more time, and now I'm going to bring back the opacity of that. Right. We may even just add a layer mask there. Kind of bring that off a few areas, and the hair. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to admit defeat. Two completely different images, edited individually, and lots of different steps to get those results that I achieved. But I'm a complete perfectionist, and I want those images to really reflect the way I visualized how they were going to look at the time of capture. So I hope you got something out of this. Go easy on yourself, because when you're creating your own editing workflow, it can take time, especially when you're still learning what every tool in Photoshop does and how it's going to affect your image. But my best advice is practice as much as you can, get in, play with your images, and if you don't like the results, don't save them. As you've seen, actions are a big part of my workflow, and I'd be lost really without them. But if you want to learn how to edit without actions, you can follow my tutorials on kellybrownonline.com for those step-by-step instructions on how to achieve everything that we just did with actions without using them. And if you're interested in my Photoshop actions, you can find them at newbornposing.com under the editing tab. There are multiple action sets that will help you achieve many different results. They do help you speed up your workflow. However, I recommend learning how to create all of those steps without actions so that you can achieve maximum results when you are using them. Well, that's it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you've got any questions, add them to the comments below and hit that little bell so that you get a notification next time I upload a new video. Take care, guys. Bye.